So I have another storyboard that I did a long time ago at American Dad that I wanted to go over step by step with you, that sort of summarizes, I think, what we're trying to do as a storyboard artist to enhance a script visually. I'm going to take you through it step by step, and then hopefully we'll have a little time left over for any questions going on. So this is a storyboard I did years ago. Oh my goodness, could be a decade ago now. In this episode, the character of Jeff has been stranded on another planet, and he meets a shapeshifter who shapeshifts into his wife because her goal is to get him to stay with her forever on this planet. So I want to make sure it's confusing. I will remind you through that the character starts off looking like his wife and then shapeshifts back to a form that was the first form that he saw her in. And so the shapeshifter has brought Jeff back to her apartment and wants to convince him to stay on the planet with her. And he decides that no, he actually does have a plan for getting off the planet and back to his real wife. This sequence occurred at the end of Act 2. I was given to it, and I realized when I got the script that everything that happens in this sequence drives the entire rest of the episode. The entire third act was going to be the fallout of what Jeff decided in this sequence. So I wanted to enhance visually as much as possible Jeff's decision-making process, because the entire rest of the episode was going to hinge on it. So I'm going to try and take you through this episode, and let me make the screen as big as possible so you can see here. All right. This was done, like I said, this is done 10 years ago, and the way we were doing the episodes back then is that we would have one panel of the background, and then the rest of the panels would simply have the characters on them. And because we had an animatics department, we had actual editors who were going to put all this together. This was, now that Toon Boom does animatics in Storyboard Pro, that has been shifted more and more onto the storyboard artists. But just so you see, so she lives in a storage container, which is why I tried to draw these, nothing really round, but these edges around the doorway, these elements that make it look like a storage container, rags hanging, trying to make it home, but obviously dealing with scraps that she was able to pick out. And so she comes in bringing Jeff, and you can see that one of the first things every storyboard artist should do is line up the door and where the characters are heading so that characters don't have to walk in perspective. It's very important. When you do perspective stuff in prime time and then it gets sent overseas and comes back, you never know if it's going to come back exactly right. So we line up the characters nice and even so that she can push him down onto the bed to try and convince him to stay. Now, once this is establishing shot, and so this gets the characters into the room and over to the bed. Once that happens, we go to kiss. All of this blank space is not necessary anymore. So what was important about this shot was to show that they come in through the room and go to the bed. Once they're at the bed, there's no reason to see the room anymore. So that's why what motivates the cut into the close-up, because a kiss is so subtle, we want to be able to see what's happening. And of course, to see that he turns his head away from her as he's like, you know what? I don't think I can do this, because he, of course, knows that this is not really his wife. We cut now out to not nearly as wide as the establishing. We already know what the room looks like, but just wide enough that we can see. Oh, and there were some jumps and poses, because there's, like I said, there's a lot of poses and a lot of dialogue that goes on. It isn't necessary for what I'm trying to show you right now, so I skipped a bunch of the stuff that wasn't necessary. So I cut to this medium shot, because what I'm looking to do is to arrange them into this pose. This was my storytelling pose that I came up with right at the beginning. And the idea here is that they are not connecting. She brought him to her room to connect. Jeff knows that this is not really his wife. He doesn't belong on this planet, so he has second thoughts. The director and supervising director all wanted me to do this shot. This is how they envision it. This is the standard primetime sitcom formula for having characters where we can see them 3/4 front faces lined up next to each other, proscenium flat staging, shallow depth. This is exactly the shot that everyone wanted out of this. But the reason that this is my storytelling shot is because simply they are not connecting. So they're facing in opposite directions. To me, this tells the story of emotionally where they are in this sequence. I still have the 3/4 front heads. None of that has changed. I still have the bodies 3/4 front. Everything is visual and equal and shown, but the breaking of the eye contact, the having the heads in separate direction, shows the lack of contact that to me was the entire point of this episode. I cut in closer as he starts explaining why. And the big reason here is that, and then of course she shape-shifts back to her original form in the background. And the reason is that he's just more important right now. His emotional state is what's important. And I want people to really connect with where he's figuring out that he's been set up to stay on this planet and he doesn't want to be here. So I just make him bigger. And this is another thing that came from this camera setup. By moving my camera over here, I was able to make sure that he would be bigger in this next shot. The other thing that was very important to me, as he first comes over from here and starts questioning himself, this pose to me was like a giant question mark. This is what his internal struggle is going on right now, was him figuring it out. So once he gets here and he figures out what he needs to do to get off, that he needs to get off the planet and how he's going to do it, we cut back to this initial wide and we go from that question mark to an exclamation point. Now that he's like, I've got it. Hey, I know. And this is where he turns. He's like, I know what I need to do. So now that he's figured out what he needs to do, I have him physically cross the room until he turns and is in a new position. And the reason is that once he goes, I know what to do, his head goes to a new space. He has figured something out. And so I have him cross the room and physically go into a new space to match the mental thing that we can't see visually, but to say what's going on. And he's going to turn. And so now they are able to have a connection with each other as he enters a new space, both emotionally and physically, and is able to turn to her, hey, why don't you come with me? And what I do with this shot, and I think this shot is very important because him asking her to come is going to drive some of what happens in Act 3, whether she shows up to help him or not. So it's important. Having this thing close up helps the audience to remember it as being important. Also, he does this gesture with me this way that is framed physically by the door to show where he says, come with me. He is meaning, let's get out of here and go through my new space together. And I frame his gesture to the door so that subliminally we're understanding what that means. We have a cut back to her where she says that she just can't bring herself to do it. So he is going to exit now. He's going to say, okay, I really wish you'd change your mind. And off he goes through the door. We cut back to this close-up. We've seen the close-up already after this moment. We have this close-up. he takes off. We cut back to the close-up we've seen before, where we get a beat of her emotional moment before she looks up because there's a noise, and we see that this alien has instead come in, and he propositions her with something awful, and then he runs out. Now, I certainly could have had Jeff turn and exit, and then had the alien come in the door and make the proposition to her. The reason I wanted this way, first of all, was seeing a character's emotional response is important to having us relate to a character. Also, when she hears something and looks up, the audience is setting up an expectation. Oh, Jeff has come back to her. And then, of course, the payoff is, the joke is that it's not Jeff. And so what happens becomes a little bit funnier because we set up an expectation that Jeff would be coming back, and he didn't. I know that was a ton of information, but these are sort of the thought process that we will go through as a storyboard artist to figure out the point of what was written, how the script is moving a story forward, and then what we're going to do to, at every moment, visually and artistically enhance what's going on so that we hopefully end up with a story that resonates more emotionally, personally to the audience, and have a better story, a better episode, a better show, and just have a better work that we do. This is what we're all about, and then move on to the next, then the next, and the next. If a television series will do 20 episodes in a year, it's 10 hours of content. It's quite a bit, and we got to do it as fast as possible. But it certainly doesn't mean that we don't want to make it as good as possible the entire time that we're going.